All right. Good morning, everybody. My name is John Morris, and I have the privilege of being the director of the Knight Alzheimer's Disease Research Center at Washington University and its clinical operations, the Memory and Aging Project. And we are delighted to welcome all of our participants and their families and all of our friends to this virtual version of our 2020 participants meeting. As you recall, we typically have the in-person meeting in early June each year, but because of COVID-19, had to rethink how we were going to present this, and today is the result. I am very much indebted to a group of individuals who helped put this virtual meeting together. They include from the Knight Alzheimer's Disease Research Center, Ron Hawley, Howard Palmer, Andre Denny, Jennifer Phillips, and Krista Mulder. Krista, some of you may know, is the executive director of the Knight ADRC, and a very important person, and today also happens to be her birthday, so you can give her a virtual happy birthday greeting.
Year's just been a crazy year.
Okay, I began with this a screenshot showing that the casualty of the fact that we're having a virtual participants meeting today is that we cannot serve you breakfast. But just looking at this makes me hungry, so maybe I'm going to ask Ron to go ahead and get rid of that. Thank you. All right, so if you're able to see me, you notice that I'm wearing a mask. I don't need the mask in this conference room where I'm the sole participant, but I simply wanted to encourage everybody, faculty, staff, and participants and family, to please remain safe and well during this most unusual pandemic. We will open up the floor in just a moment to our panelists, all of whom presented via a recorded manner their presentations on the topic that we've asked them to present on. And those individuals include Dr. Joy Ballsberry, Dr. Bo Ansis, Dr. Joy Snyder, Dr. Denise Head, Dr. Jessica Mazursky, and Marissa Streitz, one of our social workers. We're very appreciative of the effort they have gone through to make their presentations, which hopefully you've had an opportunity to see in the week or so before this meeting today. But we'll have them serve as panelists to answer some of the questions that have come in from those of you who have looked at the presentations. There is an opportunity, I am told, for people who are participating in this meeting via the streaming service that Ron Hawley has set up. There should be an opportunity, if you have a question, to enter it via the chat mechanism. You'll need to put in a name, could be your first name. Please don't put in your full name for purposes of confidentiality. You'll see a box where you have to accept the terms and conditions. Then you hit join, and it will say type a message, which you type in. And then there's a little arrow that you click, and your message will, your question or chat will be monitored here and given to me. All right, so I wanted to just update everyone on some important initiatives and developments that have occurred even since we've done our recorded presentations. First, some of you may be aware that a company in our Cortex Innovation District called C2N, the company is called C2N, announced that they now have a viable blood test to determine the presence of amyloid in individuals who may be at risk for developing Alzheimer's disease. And this is now being made available by C2N, the company, for clinical testing. At this point, it cost about $1,250. And since it is brand new, no insurance company nor Medicare has had an opportunity to decide whether they are going to reimburse the cost. So right now, if people would like with their physician to get a blood test to determine whether they have abnormal levels of amyloid in the blood, they will have to pay out of pocket. But the interesting, the very important aspects of this plasma test is the test was developed in large part from the participants in the Memory and Aging Project, from you. You recall when you come in for your assessments, we do a blood draw, and some of that blood went to C2N to allow them to develop this assay. This was based upon a research protocol developed by an associate director of the Knight ADRC, Dr. Randy Bateman. But you, the participants, should take great pride in your contribution to what may become a clinical way to determine whether a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease is supported by abnormal plasma levels. So thank you for that, and we will see how this develops. Some of you also may have heard that there's a drug that is being considered by the Food and Drug Administration for possible approval to treat Alzheimer's disease. And this would be to treat the mechanisms of Alzheimer's disease. In fact, the drug targets this brain protein amyloid beta. We don't know what the outcome of the Food and Drug Administration's decision will be about it, but we'll hear more about this during the question and answer period. The drug is called aducanumab, and we'll talk more about it. Many of you are aware that the Memory and Aging Project and the Knight ADRC are supported in large part by funding from the National Institutes of Health, primarily the National Institute on Aging, and that every few years we have to reapply to extend that funding because the National Institute on Aging wants to know that we're making appropriate progress rather than just giving us a blank check. And so this is a competitive process. We have to compete with other institutions and centers that are also seeking funding. And it's prioritized on the basis of how our work is viewed by our peers, whether it's rated well or not. And we just heard that we have a good rating from the reviewers of our application to renew the adult children study, our program project, for another 5 years. We don't have the funding yet, but we have a positive score, which we're very pleased about. And of course, we'll let you know when the funding itself is secured. Also, we are very grateful to all of our supporters. About 70% of the Knight ADRC is supported by the National Institutes of Health funding, public funding, but about 30% comes from other sources, primarily philanthropy. And we've been extremely pleased and humbled by the very generous support of many individuals and families. And I mentioned that in my recorded presentation, including the Charles F. and Joanne Knight and their family, and Roger and Paula Riney. I didn't indicate in my recorded presentation, but another corporate sponsor of in particular, our special program to look at a rare form of Alzheimer's disease that is caused by a gene mutation. The study is called Diane, receives very generous support from the Alzheimer's Association and from Edward Jones Company here in St. Louis and nationally. And for that, we want to thank John Berline, who was a former, is now a retired partner from Edward Jones, but he has worked very, very diligently to ensure that we are supported, and we appreciate that as well. Two final notes before we open it up for questions. We have to ask everybody who participates in our research to give their informed consent for us to do that. And when you sign up for research, we go over the consent form with you and let you know what's involved, and you agree or not to do it. We've had to revise our informed consent procedure because COVID-19 has taught us that we are going to need to be able to see a future where we're going to be contacting our participants remotely. And it's become apparent that we would like to do this by several means, including text messaging, which means we have to ask for everyone's permission that you will allow us to text you on your cell phone or whatever. And that wasn't in our original consent form. So we have to add that, which means we have to ask you to look over and sign this new consent form giving us that permission. So if you are confused about why we're sending this to you in the mail, it basically is to improve our opportunities to communicate with you. We have, second point is we've been conducting many of our clinical assessments remotely. This means a two-step process. The first is we interview the participant's study partner, or sometimes called the collateral source, generally a family member, and that is conducted by one of our clinicians. We do not, in that interview, contact you, the participant. We're getting your study partner's assessment of how things are going. And for that, we'd like to interview the study partner alone. So that's why we call the study partner and not you, but you, the participant, then are going to be called, and we are going to contact you alone, and we're going to evaluate your memory and thinking performance. Your test, we have some testing. So it's a little different than when you come into the Memory and Aging Project for your annual assessment in person, where we have both you and the study partner, but here we do it in a two-step process. All right, so with that, I will now remove my mask. Remember, I'm in this room alone, and we will open it up for questions from you, the participants, to our distinguished panel. So I'd like first to get an update on this drug that is being considered by the Food and Drug Administration. And for that, I'm going to ask Dr. Joy Snyder, who is professor of neurology here at Washington University, but also a long-standing senior memory and aging project clinician, and now the leader of the Knight ADRC Clinical Trials Unit. The Clinical Trials Unit participates in experimental studies, that's the trial, clinical trial of new drugs that are being tested to find out if they help people or not with Alzheimer's dementia. So that's a research unit evaluating drugs. And our clinical trials unit was testing this drug, aducanumab, and Dr. Snyder was the investigator here at Washington University for our participation in that. So Joy, what is the status of this new drug?
Well, well, good morning, everybody, and thanks, John. The status is more up in the air now than it was a week ago. So the FDA had some sort of positive comments about it, and the stock shot up about a week ago. And then a panel of distinguished experts met that was convened by the FDA, and most of them did not support approving the drug. So they advised the FDA, and I think the stock then went down some. But the FDA has not made its decision yet. They will make their decision, I believe, by March of next year. So they are still considering whether or not to approve this drug based on the current information. So we still don't know if the drug will be approved. The company is continuing to do studies of the drug. So we have 7 people here at WashU who are receiving the drug as part of the open label part of the study, which means everybody gets the drug. They're continuing to collect data on it. So whatever the FDA decides in March, I think there will be continued studies on this medication, and we'll see what happens. I think when a lot of people have been polling experts in the field, I'm sure you have received some of these polls, as Dr. Ances and the other folks here, and I think it's a pretty mixed bag as to what people think will happen. So stay tuned. We still don't know. I think that the bottom line is this will be the first of probably many drugs over the coming years that will come up for approval, and hopefully others will have a more clear path because the studies will have been completed in the way they were planned, which was not the case with this one.
Thanks, Joy. I'll just add a couple of comments, and we here at the Knight ADRC and all of you are, of course, interested in whether the drug works and whether it's going to help patients with Alzheimer's disease. So that's our major focus. But as Dr. Snyder pointed out, of course, the drug company wants to do the very same thing, but it also wants to get a return on its investment. It wants to get a profit. And these decisions, as Dr. Snyder pointed out, have tremendous repercussions on the value of that company's stock. So the company is called Biogen. And when the Food and Drug Administration a few days ago gave a glowing initial report on the drug, as Dr. Snyder said, Biogen's stock improved immediately by 40% in value. So it's really remarkable what the ramifications of all these decisions are. The controversy, why some people think it might not be approved, is the company ran 2 identical clinical trials of this drug in different institutions and clinical trials unit. So the one study seemed to show that the drug not only removes amyloid from the brain, that's pretty convincing, I think, but most importantly, it seemed to also benefit the patients because they didn't decline, they didn't progress in their dementia compared to the patients who got placebo, the dummy drug. So that sounds pretty good, and that's why the company wants the Food and Drug Administration to approve the drug. The problem is the identical study, remember they were doing twin studies, the identical study didn't show that. So one study shows the drug seemingly to work, the other study, not so much. So some people say we need to know whether it does or not by doing more studies. And that's the dilemma. Of course, the company and of course, patients and family would like to have a drug that works. And they're anxious to get this approved. And scientists may say, well, it's not so easy to know whether the drug works or not. And that's the crux of the matter. But I wonder, Dr. Snyder, if you would continue on. Let's hypothetically say the Food and Drug Administration approves this drug. Are we prepared to be able to administer it? Because it's not a pill, is it?
No, this drug is a drug that you get through your veins, an intravenous infusion. You have to get it once a month. We're not sure for how long you have to get it once a month, but the data from the study suggests you need to get it for quite a while, and you need to get up to a high dose. So it will require a lot of intravenous infusions. It probably will require folks who are going to get on the drug to have a test to show that they have amyloid in their brain, because as Dr. Morris mentioned, that's what the drug is targeting. The most common test we use right now is the amyloid PET scan that many of you have had as part of your memory and aging participation. This has to be done at a specialized center where they can do PET scans and get the amyloid. Maybe someday we can use the new blood test that was just developed, but right now, the way the study was done and the way the drug may be approved, we're not sure, is that it may require an amyloid PET scan or maybe a look at spinal fluid, as many of you have done in the Memory and Aging Project. So in order to be ready to treat folks with this drug, we need to be able to test people with these amyloid PET scans or spinal fluid. We need to have an infusion center ready to infuse them. And we need folks who know about Alzheimer's disease, experts like you see at the Memory and Aging Project, who know what is Alzheimer's disease and what isn't, in order to get the right people treated. It's also likely this drug will be approved for people with pretty mild Alzheimer's disease. So we need experts who can identify that mild stage of the disease. If it happened today, we would not be ready, but I know here at Washington University and at Barnes-Jewish Hospital, we're having frequent meetings to try to get ready for this, to hire more staff, to make sure we have the PET scans in the infusion centers. So it's going to be a lot of preparation, and it's already started. But as Dr. Morris pointed out, it's hard to know how quickly to start because we don't know if the drug's going to be approved. So lots of moving pieces here and around the country, and we hope to be ready, but it's going to take some time and effort, and it'll take more people being involved in the treatment and diagnosis.
Yes, so thanks very much. So it's complicated. So as Dr. Snyder pointed out, it may only be approved for people in the earliest stages of Alzheimer's dementia, because that's where the data came from individuals in that earliest stage. We don't know if it works in later stages, moderate dementia, something of that sort. And yet, if I had a family member with moderate dementia, I'd like to know if they could get the drug too. So it's going to be very complicated to work all this through. But we're excited. This is what we've been working towards for all of these decades, to finally get to a point where possibly we could have a drug that actually treats the disease, Alzheimer's disease. So it's exciting, it's challenging, but this is exactly where we want to be to start considering these drugs that may help people with Alzheimer's disease dementia. All right, so now, thank you, Joy. So now we'll move on. We have a new faculty member. We have three new faculty members, Dr. Joy Ballsberry, Dr. Kyle Womack, and Dr. Jonathan Kipnis. But Dr. Joy Ballsberry is the leader of a new core, a group of individuals who are looking at particular resources to help all of us who are doing Alzheimer's disease research. And Joy Ballsberry's new core addresses health disparities and equity. And we are committed at the Knight Alzheimer's Disease Research Center to trying to improve our cultural competency and awareness so that we are welcoming to all people in the St. Louis region, not just our convenient sample of typically white individuals. We are committed to assuring that we become aware ourselves of the effects of structural racism and the past legacy of discrimination here in St. Louis and its ongoing effects. So we are very appreciative that Dr. Joy Ballsberry is helping us, lead us in this area, as does our remarkable African American Advisory Board, currently chaired by Pastor Doug Petty. But I want to turn to Joy because I'm going to ask her to indicate, is the Health Disparities and Equity Core focused only on African Americans in St. Louis? Joy?
Hello, everyone. Dr. Morris, thank you so much for providing me the opportunity to speak today. And I'd like to thank the others, my colleagues that are also here on the panel, as well as our participants for giving up a bit of your time on a Saturday. To answer Dr. Morris's question related to the new core, the new Health Disparities and Equity Core, and if our focus is only on African Americans, I'd like to say no. I am African American. I am from St. Louis, and I do have loved ones who've experienced the impacts and the effects of Alzheimer's disease and related dementia. But I would not be doing my due diligence as a new lead if I didn't consider the impact that these diseases have on diverse communities, not just the community in which I come from. So we are interested in expanding our efforts to underrepresented and under-resourced community members in the St. Louis metro area. We are also thinking about how we can partner with other local agencies, local community groups, as well as some of the national organizations. There's been a tremendous amount of effort within the African American community through the African American Advisory Board. We have some other colleagues who are working in the space of Hispanic and Latinx community. And then we also really want to think about not only structural racism and structural discrimination, but how that impacts economic status and social determinants of health as it relates to access to care and the ability to receive proper care. Dr. Morris mentioned a new test that came out, and it's $1,000. There are many of our community members, regardless to race, who would not be able to financially afford such tests. And so one of our goals is to think creatively of how we can partner around clinical trial enrollment, around enrollment and recruitment and retention, and to other study types, but more so thinking about health promotion and education around the historical underpinnings of historical mistrust as it relates to research, and how we can change that dynamic to increase cultural competency and awareness. John, did I answer your question?
Perfectly. And I'd like you to expand and let our participants know about a new initiative that for which you will be seeking funding from the National Institutes of Health to expand our community-wide presence. You want to talk about that?
Yes. So one of the things that we now have the opportunity to apply for from the National Institute on Aging is what they call an R24 application. The R24 is a 3-year grant mechanism with a $500,000 plus per year for each year, and we're going to go for the plus. I figure if we're going to apply for the funding, we're going to go for all of the money. So this will give us a chance to think creatively about how to evaluate and capture what we've been doing that's working, so current practices around recruitment, retention, and enrollment into clinical trials and outreach and engagement, while also thinking about how do we utilize some of the tools that the National Institutes on Aging have captured in a research repository called ADORE, which relates to them collecting materials on recruitment, retention, research, health education, and research literature, and evaluating those materials with our community partners and community members and patients and their families to find out if some of those materials would be appropriate in the St. Louis area, and also possibly modifying some of those materials. And then the last thing that we are hoping to do is to create what we call a research registry. The purpose of that registry will be to enroll underrepresented and under-resourced community members and their partners or their caregivers or family members into a registry where we'll be able to ask them what types of studies would they like to be involved in. And if they want to provide biomarker data, we'd be able to do that as well. But also thinking about what are ways that we can disseminate health education and promotion and research information back to those community members in a way that they feel is appropriate for them. So the registry would enroll current participants in CBIRD, which is Dr. Bateman's large study, our traditional cohort within the NIGHT ADRC, but also looking at other trials and studies that are not necessarily connected to the NIGHT ADRC as a resource for those principal investigators as well.
Great, thanks very much, Joy. So as I indicated, the Knight ADRC is very pleased to have Dr. Ballsberry and her growing team to help us be based in the entire community, not just a segment of the community. And that gives us an opportunity then to ask questions. Does Alzheimer's disease, or for that matter, brain aging, differ as a matter of one's self-reported race or ethnicity? If we only study Alzheimer's disease in white people, maybe we only learn about Alzheimer's disease in white people, so we have to study it in all people here. So we want to do that. We want to see if there might be differences. We're talking about this drug, aducanumab. Almost all of the data as to whether the drug helped patients or not came from the members of the participants in the clinical trials who were 98% white.
Mhm.
So we don't know if the drug does work. Will it work in Hispanics? Will it work in Asian Americans? Will it work in African Americans? We don't know. So we're committed to this. And as we look at whether there are racial differences, a relatively easy thing for researchers to think about, well, if there are differences, it must be due to different genes or different biological problems or biological characteristics that racial groups carry that may be different from other racial groups. Well, it turns out that's lazy to assume that things are genetic or biologic. As a matter of fact, there are very minimal racial difference, genetic differences between races. It's remarkable that there's more range of differences within the group of individuals who calls themselves Caucasian or white than between races. So it's probably not so, it's simplistic to assume that things may be biologic, everything must be biologic. So why, if there are differences, and maybe if they're not biologic or genetic, what could they be due to? Well, we haven't until recently given this much thought, but what about people who endure discrimination throughout a lifetime? Well, we know that everyday discrimination comes with stress. And stress has deleterious effects on us, our bodies. Maybe stress plays a role, and stress comes from discrimination. But if we're not capturing this information in our research, we can't evaluate that. So Marissa Streitz from our Memory and Aging Project has laudably taken on the task of trying to determine how we can capture events and situations that occur over a lifetime that may influence how people express or do not express disease. These are often called social determinants of health. Marissa, do you want to pick up and talk about the new battery that we are planning to incorporate in our Memory and Aging Project?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. So the new battery that Dr. Morris is referring to, we are calling it Life Courses Influencing Aging and Dementia, or the LIAD study. So far, what we're really trying to look at, what the crux of this is we're looking at social determinants of health, such as your socioeconomic status, which includes your occupation, your income, even your wealth level. We're looking a lot at neighborhood and environmental, social built environments, and we're looking at things of your childhood. All of these factors we have compiled into this new survey, that the LIAD survey, which about 100 of you have completed 2 times for us, which is wonderful. And we're really looking at the psychometric properties of that. We're looking if it's valid, if this survey gets what we're looking at, if it's effective enough. And also we are very slowly starting to team up with other research institutions around the United States to also look at social determinants of health in their population. So even larger data sample, as Dr. Morris had mentioned.
Great. Thanks, Marissa. So this is something that not just us here at the Knight ADRC, but I think the Alzheimer community is recognizing is has been a very understudied but now very important area to capture this information and determine how one's expression of disease might be influenced by these factors that occur over a lifetime. Now, one of the issues that some of us over a lifetime are interested in doing is, can we reduce our risk for developing brain illnesses or specifically Alzheimer's disease? And many of you have heard that maybe staying socially engaged and mentally active can be helpful, possibly. But we also hear about physical activity and exercise. And I'm going to ask Denise Head from our Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences to give an update on a project that she is leading to look at physical activity and exercise that will be part of this new adult children study grant that I mentioned we're optimistic is going to get funded for another 5 years. Denise, you want to talk about your project?
Yes, I'd be happy to. Thank you. And again, as everyone else has said, I'm glad some people were able to join us here on a Saturday, and we're very excited to be able to tell you about some of the things that we're going to get started on. And yes, there has been this sense that physical activity and exercise may be beneficial in reducing the risk of Alzheimer's disease. And so there's been some I would call observational studies. If we ask people how much you're engaging in exercise and then look 10 years later, do you have a reduced risk? And some of that work is promising, but one of the things that's not clear is what may be the mechanism by which physical activity and exercise may reduce risk. How is it having an impact? I mean, that will be important for kind of understanding the degree to which any particular individual may or may not have a benefit. And so what we're excited to do is take advantage of all the resources we have here at the ADRC to examine this question fairly thoroughly. So we're getting multiple measures of how much you're engaging in physical activity and exercise by wearing watches that you wear, that kind of a watch type device, having you get an assessment of your cardiorespiratory fitness, asking you what you're engaging in. So getting a really good measure of how much activity people are engaging in. And then using data that we have here at the ADR, other data from blood samples, from the cerebrospinal fluid, to get at what these proteins are that may be beneficial and having a good impact on our synapses. And then seeing if that actually is associated with brain structure and memory and these proteins that are related to Alzheimer's disease, the amyloid that Dr. Morris mentioned. And so we're going to have a really good hope to have a really good understanding of the brain mechanisms by which physical activity and exercise may be beneficial. But importantly, if we then also follow people again over 5-10 years, starting off who are clinically healthy, and they may or may not be engaging in exercise, we have all these indications of mechanisms. We can see what is the degree to which over time you really are at a reduced risk. So really get a good way of answering that question. So we're very excited about the project.
Great, terrific. We look forward to seeing all our incredibly physically active and physically fit participants go through this study. That's terrific. All right, so I'm going to introduce now Dr. Bo Ansis, who is the Daniel Brennan, MD, professor of neurology here at Washington University and a worldwide expert in brain imaging of Alzheimer's disease, as well as of the effect of infections on the brain, including HIV infection. So it's a little bit interesting how Dr. Ansis, now this world expert in neuroimaging, is going to focus on the gut. So, Bo, do you want to tell us why the gut may have something to do with the brain?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you, Dr. Morse, for that great introduction. And it's really a pleasure to be with such a great panel of people, as well as thank you to all of our participants for coming out today. As you were hearing from Dr. Morris, we hope that there's a little bit more sun coming out today, but thank you for taking a little bit of time out of your busy schedules to do this. So we have been very interested, and I had in the beginning of the pictures because I know so much, and we were all talking about this. One of the great things out of the participant breakfast is the food. And I had actually the sausages, and we love talking about that. But more importantly, it really is, if we think about it, you are what you eat. And so there are very strong connections actually between the gut and the brain. And we're now starting to learn about those kinds of connections. And it may be very important. In particular, there are different kinds of bacteria that we all have naturally in our gut that are breaking things down. And that may change with certain kinds of diseases. We already know that that's already present in Parkinson's disease. And now there is starting to be work that is looking at Alzheimer's disease. And so we've been very interested, as what you were hearing from Dr. Morris, and also you just heard from Dr. Head, of kind of trying to figure out where are those changes in the gut microbiome occurring and how early on is this occurring. And so we've been very fortunate enough to work with many of you where we've actually sent you small little hats where you do your business. And in fact, in reality, when John asked why I've been so interested in this, I've gained credence in my family because I now talk about poop and my kids love that. And because of that, now we are actually looking at the poop. And so we're asking you to provide a small stool sample, which is then couriered back to us. And we're analyzing those, analyzing that stool. And what we've been starting to see is that there is actually changes in the gut that are associating with these changes in the amyloid and the tau that you heard Dr. Morris looking at. And that may be very, very important because that'll be able to allow us to stage an individual. So we now may have a biomarker, a way to look at an individual, as well as looking and working with Dr. Snyder and others. There are even ideas of trials to look at certain kinds of foods or certain kinds of other ways to kind of change the gut flora and how that may actually affect and also reduce chances of developing Alzheimer's disease. So we think that the gut is a very important area and that link to the brain will be very important. And that's why we're now starting to investigate this.
Great. So the gut is really full of bacteria that are essential for our well-being, helping us break down all the nutrients and things of that sort. But don't they have a role with inflammation?
That's right. And so we do think that gut, when it becomes a little bit affected, it becomes leaky. And that inflammation then can actually go to the brain. And that inflammation in the brain can also affect the amyloid and the tau. And we think that maybe inflammation is sometimes good, but it can also be sometimes bad, and specifically bad to the brain. And so these changes in the gut will be measuring not only by looking at it in the stool, but we'll also be looking at it in the blood. And we also think, and there's one of the questions that was asked is that, are there changes in inflammatory disorders, or are there changes even because of exercise? And we'll be now able to look at those kinds of changes and link up, are there changes in physical exercise that are affecting the gut that is then affecting the brain, and vice versa? And so really this kinds of nicely parallels and links with a number of the studies that are currently being done at the ADRC, the NIGHT ADRC.
So I would imagine, though, that not everyone follows the exact same diet or takes the same kind of medications or prepares food in the same way. Are these factors?
Yes, they are. And so we're actually asking individuals, if you are providing us a stool sample, we're asking you about your history of any other kinds of inflammatory disorders or anything else that you may be having, as well as what was your last food intake? And so we're actually asking you to fill out a little bit of a log. And when you do that, you're sending it back with not only that log, but the stool sample, which we're then looking at. And it may also be very important of different antibiotics. And so we're actually looking at those effects as well too. So I do think that we will be recording those kinds of differences. And hopefully if a large number of our individuals are interested in doing this, we'll be able to start to discriminate what are those effects.
Great. Thanks very much, Bo. Terrific. And I should mention that along with Dr. Head's proposed research on physical activity and physical fitness, that this gut and the microbiome, the bacteria in the gut, is also part of this new adult children study grant that we are optimistic will get funded for another 5 years. All right, so for I don't know how many years now, many of you have been requesting access, knowledge of your results of the various tests that we put you through in the Memory and Aging Project, including your PET amyloid scan and so forth. And me, Dr. Morris, has been saying for these many years, yes, we will do that for you. But Dr. Morris also says that if we're going to do it, we have to understand what it is we're communicating and to evaluate whether that has any potential positive or adverse effects. And so we're very grateful to Drs. Sarah Hartz and Dr. Jessica Mazurski for getting a project to return some of the research results that participants undergo to the participants who would like to know them. And the results would include the amyloid PET scan results. So we thought that this study would have been launched by now, and many of you will be able to participate in this. We know that not everyone necessarily wants to participate and learn the results, but COVID-19 happened. And so where we were optimistic that we would be underway in this study by now, we have yet to get the final approval to launch it. But Dr. Jessica Mazurski is here to report on the return of research results to all of you, and to say that in fact, Dr. Morris hasn't been blowing smoke. We are going to be doing this. Jessica?
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Morris, and thank you, everyone. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here, and I could not want to reiterate more what Dr. Morris said. We are working very hard, but we are a little behind due to COVID. But we promise you, in fact, we met yesterday with Dr. Morris and Dr. Mulder and the whole research team to finalize and review the process. We are submitting the project to our institutional review board yesterday. Literally, the button was submitted. So we did get a little behind because of COVID. And just to let you know, from a timeline point of view, we got the funding for this study in February of 2020, and COVID hit in March. And all of WashU, as you know, was sort of suspended. We were unable to even hire a clinical research coordinator, but we now have someone in place who started in August. So we are working quickly, but it is to acknowledge we are a little bit behind. Our current goal is that we would ideally start recruitment in January, assuming everything goes to plan, but we do ask you to be a little bit patient with us because we are dealing, of course, with some challenges because of COVID, but we are ready to go and moving forward, and the hope is to launch in January.
Great, but Jessica, you're not starting off by accepting just anybody in this. You're going to start off with a sort of a subset of our population. Why is that?
So we do have a set of eligibility criteria, and that's because, so the criteria, and everyone who meets this criteria will be offered the option. So that's important to know. Many, if you meet this criteria, you will be offered over the coming likely 12 months, the option to receive your research results. And the eligibility are that you must be over age 65. And the reason for that, just to clarify, is because below age 65, the risk is extremely low of developing Alzheimer's dementia. And we're returning to people their risk of developing Alzheimer's disease dementia in 5 years. So the lowest age limit is 65. You must be cognitively normal, so have no memory and thinking problems now, and also have had an MRI and PET scan within the prior 18 months. And the reason for that is because we need to use your results to give you an estimate of what your risk is of developing Alzheimer's disease, and we need to have quite recent results. So we have a criteria that within the last 18 months. And I guess it's probably worth mentioning now, we know that scans have been halted. So scans are a little bit behind. So we are anticipate there might be some delays again in who gets invited. Everybody will be invited, but there may be some delays as we catch up and scans and visits get back up to speed.
But After you and Dr. Hartz, Dr. Mazursky, get your initial data from this group of 65 and older normal people and how the results do or do not affect them, isn't the ultimate goal to try to return, if things go well, to try to return results to everybody?
Absolutely. So I think our ultimate goal, and we strongly believe, and our work is inspired by what participants have told us, which is that participants do have a right to know when they want to know results that we have a reasonable amount of confidence in what they can tell you, right? So these results are still research results. They're not clinical results. But we must start within a particular set of criteria because it's a research study. So that's why we have to set these sort of boundaries that you're over 65 and currently cognitively normal. But once we have evidence, and we hope the evidence indicates that there are not large psychological harms and the impact on cognitive outcomes is not negative, then we hope that we could expand this much more broadly and that results could be returned to many more people in future. We need to sort of get the process started and understand the evidence.
Great, Jessica, thanks so very much. So we have a number of questions, and I'll try to get as many of these addressed as possible. So Dr. Snyder, we're talking about aducanumab and mentioning other drugs that have promise. Don't most of these drugs address this brain protein amyloid beta? And is that wise? Aren't there other targets or other proteins in the brain that we ought to be addressing as well?
Absolutely. And that has been one of the challenges in the field recently, is that almost all the drugs that have been tested at the sort of the phase 2 and 3 stage, where they are getting ready to go up for approval, have been these amyloid targeting drugs. And it's been very disappointing. We haven't had a new drug approved in 17 years. So that's a challenge. So we do have other drugs coming down the pipeline. At the Knight ADRC Clinical Trials Unit, we'll be starting a study probably in January of a drug targeting tau, the other protein that's very prominent in Alzheimer's disease. This is the protein that's inside the brain cells in what are called the neurofibrillary tangles, as opposed to the amyloid, which is outside the cells and the amyloid plaques. So we're excited about that. We're also going to be starting a new study in the next few months targeting the gut microbiome, as Dr. Ansys was mentioning. This is a drug that was recently approved for use in China. It's called oligomanate. It's a drug that alters your gut microbiome, and it's going to be tested in people with more severe symptoms of Alzheimer's disease than we're testing in the other studies. So that's certainly one we're excited about. And lots of drugs targeting inflammation are going to be coming up in the future. So there's a lot of excitement looking at a lot of different mechanisms. One of the challenges in the field is that maybe, like in cancer, we may have to use more than one drug. We may have to use combinations, and that's hard to test in an Alzheimer's trial, but those things will probably be coming in the future as well.
So Dr. Snyder, why are we waiting until people have developed Alzheimer's dementia to treat individuals? They have dementia because their brain cells aren't working very well or they're dead, right? Why are we waiting that long to have a damaged brain?
Well, we're not waiting that long, so that's a good segue. The other types of studies we're doing are studies to prevent people from developing symptoms. So these studies have been going on for several years here at the Knight ADRC and around the country and the world, looking at folks who are cognitively normal, but who have perhaps amyloid deposition seen on one of the PET scans or via the spinal fluid. So these studies are ongoing. The first one that was started was actually started here at WashU, and this was one treating people without symptoms who have one of the genetic causes of Alzheimer's disease in the dominantly inherited Alzheimer's network study that Dr. Morris mentioned earlier. So that study continues to go on, treating asymptomatic people. There's also a study called A4, Anti-Amyloid Against Alzheimer, I think is what it stands for. That is a national study that is fully enrolled, and we'll find out in 2022 if treating people with one of these IV antibodies can prevent them from getting Alzheimer's symptoms. So that's very exciting. And we are hopefully in the next couple of weeks going to start enrolling here at WashU for the next study of that type called AHEAD, which is also for folks who have no symptoms yet. It's also using one of those amyloid antibodies. So we are hopeful someday to have a study like that uses some other target. But right now, those are targeted against amyloid. But that's a very important part of the research. And again, it's made possible because of folks at WashU primarily who helped us develop these biomarkers so that we know that the brain changes of Alzheimer's begin long before the symptoms do, and gives us this opportunity to treat people before they have symptoms. So thanks to you, we're able to have these studies.
Didn't one of our memory and aging project participants, who also is a member of our African American Advisory Board, get national recognition for this?
Indeed. So one of our research participants, Dr. Collins Lewis, who is also a part of our African American Advisory Board and participates in memory and aging, volunteered for this A4 study. And we nominated him for a Cornerstone Award from the Global Alzheimer Platform, which he received. And I'm not sure if the press release is out yet, should be soon. There'll be videos online at the Global Alzheimer's Platform. And we're very excited about the privilege of working with Dr. Collins Lewis, as well as with him getting this award. It's certainly well-deserved for his work both as a research volunteer, which, as you know, in both memory and aging and in a clinical trial involves a lot of time and effort and literally blood and spinal fluid as well. And also his work in the community to help us do the things Dr. Joy Ballsberry was talking about, to expand research to cover all communities and to be inclusive. So we're very proud of him and proud that we're able to work with him.
Great, thanks, Joy. Dr. Ansis, is there a connection between medications given for overactive bladder and dementia?
There is, and so that it can lead to actual changes in the cognition. And so we have to be very, very careful when we're prescribing some of these medications to individuals and really watch those kinds of changes. And so that doesn't exactly relate to the gut microbiome directly, but it is, we do.
I just wanted to see how well informed you were, Bo. I was.
I play many different roles, John. Yes, thank you. But yes, it does. And so we do have to worry about those prescriptions. And some of our work, and when we're seeing individuals, as you know, at the Night ADRC or when they're being evaluated, one of the things that we're actively looking at is, and we've also worked with a number of our members of our geriatric psychiatry team, is looking for deprescribing. So is there a real need for those medications? How many interactions are there between different kinds of medications? And so when we're evaluating and seeing participants as well as seeing patients, we're talking to them about that.
Great. So just to give some names of some of these medications, which were really quite commonly used in older adults. Some of the trade names are Detrol or Ditropin. These are effective in helping to reduce overactive bladder because they act against a chemical that nerve cells use to activate things, and it's called the acetylcholine system. So these drugs are designed to inhibit the acetylcholine system. Unfortunately, those drugs don't just go to the bladder area to calm down those hyperactive neurons, those cholinergic neurons. They also get into the brain, and there the cholinergic system is involved in memory. So if the drug gets into the brain and dampens down those cholinergic neurons, it can affect the brain function, particularly the memory function of the brain. Matter of fact, many of the drugs that you've heard about that we use to treat the symptoms of Alzheimer's disease, Aricept, donepezil, they're there to boost the cholinergic system, and yet Ditropin and Detrol counteract that. So that's the connection. I don't think the drugs cause Alzheimer's disease, but the adverse effects on memory sometimes can be reversed when you switch from those bladder drugs to other bladder drugs that have less of this cholinergic effect. But people on these drugs should, who think their memory might be affected, should be discussing it with their physicians to get alternative medications that may be of greater benefit. So it's just about 11 o'clock. I have a few more questions, and I realize some of the people who are joining us by streaming may have to leave, but I'll try to, and the panelists may have to leave, but if not, I'll try to get a few more questions in, even though we're running just a little bit over. So what I wanted to ask now was regarding a family history of Alzheimer's disease and how it causes, how a family ought to consider their risk if they had a relative with Alzheimer's disease. And it's a complicated explanation, and I don't always do a very good job of trying to explain it, but the real risk comes if you have a first-degree relative with Alzheimer's disease. That is your parent or a sibling of yours. Of course, if you have aunts and uncles affected or grandparents, and then that may have some importance for you, but it's really your parents and your siblings, because those are the ones that are closest to you in genetic makeup. And families can have all sorts of profiles of the gene that are determined by genes. People maybe come from a family where they tend to be tall, or come from a family where they tend to be short. And those are sort of determined by the genetic makeup of that particular family. And that's something that's shared by the family. Not necessarily everyone in the family is that way, but the majority are. So the genes confer within the family setting some sort of characteristics that the family may share in general. One of the genes that may be very important in why families could share risk for Alzheimer's disease is a gene called apolipoprotein E. It's for short ApoE. And this particular gene comes in 3 different varieties. There's ApoE2, ApoE3, ApoE4. If your parent carries an ApoE4 gene and passes that gene on to you, that does increase your risk of developing Alzheimer's disease, maybe 3 times as much as if you didn't have the ApoE4 gene. Now, it's complicated. Sure, it increases risk. We don't quite understand why it does that. And about half of the people who have Alzheimer's disease dementia, if we study their genetic makeup, about half will have ApoE4. So in the general population, the frequency of ApoE4 is only about 20% or so, and yet 50% of Alzheimer's people have it. So yes, it's a factor in developing Alzheimer's. However, there are many people who carry ApoE4 who don't develop Alzheimer's dementia, and 50% of people who have Alzheimer's dementia don't have ApoE4. So there are other factors besides ApoE4. Yes, it's an important factor, and it explains to some extent why some families seem to have a propensity to Alzheimer's. It's very important to recognize by itself, ApoE4 does not cause Alzheimer's. It increases risk by ways we don't understand, but it doesn't increase risk in everybody. And there are plenty of other risk factors besides ApoE to cause Alzheimer's, to put people at risk for Alzheimer's, because half of the people with Alzheimer's don't have ApoE4. So complicated, but that's why these risk factors may explain why some families seem to have an overabundance of Alzheimer's risk in the family. You know, people can find out their genetic profile now with these companies. I don't know if 23andMe is still around, but I usually don't advise that people try to understand whether they have ApoE4, whether they inherited a copy of ApoE4 from their parents, because if you find out that you do have a copy, well, yes, you know your risk is increased, but it doesn't say that you will develop Alzheimer's dementia. And if you find out you don't have a copy of APOE4, it doesn't say you're not going to develop Alzheimer's dementia. So it doesn't really change things very much, at least in my opinion. All right, so the last two questions, I'll try to combine them. We're all, you've heard from Dr. Snyder and the entire panel, and all of us at the Night ADRC are intense interest in developing effective therapies for Alzheimer's. We are wide open to anything that can help people with Alzheimer's. We're not simply limited to amyloid, or as Dr. Snyder said, tau. We're open to anything. Matter of fact, you heard Dr. Snyder say, we're going to take a Chinese drug that is derived from seaweed and started testing it to see. So we're open. But we also know that there are people who, not just in Alzheimer's, but a lot in Alzheimer's, who promote treatments for Alzheimer's disease for which there is no proof that they work. And these really, I have to be careful because I don't want to impugn anybody, but in many cases, these are opportunistic appeals to try to sell people things that sound good, but for which there are no data whatsoever to say that they're beneficial. And it doesn't mean if people want to test different programs or different strategies or different nutrients or whatever, and find out that they work, I'm wide open to accepting them. But I have a concern that people invest money in therapies that ultimately do nothing except make your urine more expensive. So I'm not going to name particular programs or treatments, but without data to proof that the drug is beneficial, I recommend caution in deciding to take them or not. I've been around long enough that I remember in the 1990s, there was great interest in estrogen for women. You know, women's more at risk of developing Alzheimer's disease, and maybe it has to do that after the menopause, they're not getting any more estrogen to the brain. So maybe estrogen replacement therapy would be beneficial. There are estrogen receptors in the brain, absolutely. And so it was very plausible. And some people prescribed estrogen replacement for postmenopausal women in an effort to prevent Alzheimer's. When the actual study was done in the very large women's health study, it showed that women who took estrogen replacement paradoxically were more at risk of developing Alzheimer's, more at risk, not protected against it. It's unexplained why that is so, but it didn't prevent. And of course, estrogen replacement therapy isn't necessarily benign. It comes with risks, including blood clots and cancer and so forth. So just be wary of trying to take unproven medications, particularly if they're going to charge you for them, because I think it benefits the company and not you. My opinion. I'm sorry. I should defer to Dr. Snyder and Dr. Ansys. It sounds like I'm on a rant here. Joy, do you want to comment?
No, I agree 100%, and I appreciate your not naming names. That's probably good, but there's a lot of people out there who you can't believe everything you read on the internet or see advertised at the Walgreens. So we're working very hard to figure out which therapies actually do work, but just because somebody tells you they do and shows you pretty pictures or describes 3 or 4 cases where they worked doesn't mean that something is a good treatment. It really does need to be tested. And even things like hormone replacement therapy, are not benign. And many of these things do cost a lot of money. So I advise my patients to spend their money on things that improve their quality of life and not things that improve somebody else's quality of life.
Okay, Bo, any comment? I'm asking Dr. Snyder and Dr. Ansis because they they manage people with Alzheimer's dementia. So this is very relevant for them. Bo, did you want to comment?
No, I totally agree. And that's why we are doing those trials and actually doing those randomized control trials. So either giving a sugar pill or looking at that versus a trial or a drug and trying to compare that. And really, if there's multiple evidence that shows that, then it's very good to recommend to individuals. And then I agree with Dr. Snyder and Dr. Morris. And you're also seeing in some of the studies that are being proposed here or things that are being looked at, being active, healthy, and mind-wise. And so you're seeing the role of, we're trying to actually elucidate, is there some role of physical activity that Dr. Head and others are looking at? And so I think of that ways and being socially engaged, and you heard from Dr. Ballsberry of being engaged in doing that, and Dr. Maritsky, who's doing that as well. And you even heard the roles of stress. So ways that you can work in your own environment, those are ways that you can control that and you can actually do that instead of, say, paying people for certain kinds of medications that we don't know as much information about.
Okay, I think we've tried to cover all the questions that have come to us. If I've missed any, it's my fault and I apologize, but we're about 10 minutes over our time. And I want to personally thank Marissa Streitz and Denise Head and Jessica Mazursky and Dr. Ansis and Dr. Snyder and Joy Ballsberry for serving as such an eminent and informative panel, and appreciate it very much, and appreciate also all of the individuals who joined us for this participants meeting. We hope, fingers crossed, that we can have our in-person participants meeting this coming June, but who knows? I mean, I thought when we shut down in March because of the pandemic, I said, well, we're going to have to be in this for the long haul. I said, I don't think we can reopen until May. And that shows how short-sighted I was about the duration of this pandemic, because we're a ways from opening up, and hopefully June will allow us to do so safely and we can have our in-person assessment again. But thanks to all of you, the participants. Thanks again to the panelists. Thanks to Ron and Howard and Andre and Jen and Krista for organizing all this. So enjoy the rest of your Saturday, everyone. Thanks so very much. We'll see you later. Bye-bye.